So I think we can get started with our first panel. Hello, I will invite them to join us and introduce myself. Hello, my name is Michelle Madden-Dempsey. I'm a professor of law at Villanova Law School and associate dean for faculty research. And I have the great honor of moderating our first panel, the root cause analysis in officer-involved shootings and civilian-involved shootings. And I'll give you a brief description both of the topic of the panel and then also an introduction of our panelists, and then I'll pass it over to them. Officer-involved shootings are incidents of great concern to the police, individuals, and communities across the nation. But are the methods we use to review these tragedies making the problem better or worse? This panel discusses various mechanisms for reviewing an officer-involved shooting, and discusses whether something called root cause analysis principles, which are commonly used in after-event reviews in other industries, such as healthcare, aviation, and others, could provide additional useful information to reduce the incidence of officer-involved shootings over time. Our experienced panel includes the following: John Hollway, Associate Dean and Executive Director of the Quattrone Center for the Fair Administration of Justice at the University of Pennsylvania Law School; Smoot, Director and Chief Counsel for the Police Benevolent and Protective Association of Illinois and the Police Benevolent Labor Committee; and Kelvyn Anderson, Executive Director of the Police Advisory Commission at the City of Philadelphia and Vice President of the National Association for Civilian Oversight of Law Enforcement. Our panelists will discuss reviews of officer-involved shootings in the civil, criminal, and administrative contexts, and compare and contrast the review process and media coverage of officer-involved shootings with the principles of root cause analysis. They will examine what additional benefits might be gained by implementing what is called just culture events reviews, which is an approach that draws on root cause analysis principles to generate quality improvements while promoting professionalism and accountability. So with that, I will pass it over to our panelists. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks very much for that introduction, and I want to thank the law school, the dean, Professor Ravenel, and the Law Review for having us and making this possible. I think it's a really important topic at a really important time. I'm John Hollway. Do I need to press this to be? Does it just stay on there? Okay. I'm John Hollway. I'm from the Quattrone Center for the Fair Administration of Justice at Penn Law. This is actually my first time here, but my wife is an alumna, my best friend is an alumnus, and it's a real honor to be here. There are a lot of conversations going on about sort of what I'll describe as unfortunate interactions, negative interactions between the police and the community, and those interactions can take a lot of different forms. But the question that I think that we want to talk about here is to sort of give you guys an overview of what some of the procedures are by which the community or administrative organizations or the police themselves review those interactions, and kind of make the point that each of the different types of reviews sort of has a different purpose and a different impact. And from the Quattrone Center perspective, we try to look at criminal justice as a system and ask, in any complex system, whether you're talking about a system like aviation or a system like healthcare or a system like criminal justice, what you're really doing is looking at a complicated series of interactions among lots of different people in sort of a high-stress, dynamic environment with zero tolerance for error. And for some reason, we can accept in healthcare and in aviation that virtually everybody in that system is trying hard to get the right result. But when we turn our lens to criminal justice, all of a sudden that gets harder. And the premise that we start from in the Quattrone Center is that the adversarial nature of criminal justice actually masks the fact that what everybody really wants to do in that system is appropriately hold perpetrators of crime accountable for their actions in ways that preserve our constitutional rights, which I might shorten to get the right guy in the right way. And within that system, as in aviation, we have plane crashes. In healthcare, we have preventable medical deaths. And in policing, we have officer-involved shootings. And there are reviews that we do that are disciplinary. There are reviews that we do that are administrative. There are reviews that we do that are inside and outside the system, and yet we still have these errors. And so the question is, what are these reviews for and how are they helpful? And is there a type of review that we could do that might actually help prevent the next error? Because it's certainly important to hold people accountable, and that's obviously the title of this whole day. But I think it's also important to try to reduce the number of errors that we have. So we'll talk about the different kinds of reviews, and let Sean and Kelvyn kind of introduce themselves and their backgrounds, and you'll get a sense of the breadth of types of reviews, and then maybe we can talk about what we can do to help improve the system with them.
Well, good morning. My name is Sean Smoot. It's an honor to be here speaking with you today. I'm the Director and Chief Counsel for the Police Benevolent Association in the state of Illinois. I'm the Treasurer of the National Association of Police Organizations and a member of President Obama's Task Force on 21st Century Policing. Those are the three hats that I'll claim today anyway, so I might have a couple others that I wear as well.
Is there a Cubs hat in there somewhere?
There might be tonight. Although I'm going back to Cleveland, where I'm also on the monitoring team for the consent decree that the police department is there.
So that's at least 5 hats.
Yeah. I have an Indians hat in my hotel room in Cleveland waiting for me. So that's just for personal safety reasons. John gave a very good kind of general summary of what we're talking about, and I think it's important to just mention at the outset, from an officer's standpoint, there is no time during their adult life that they will be in more jeopardy than when they are placed in a situation where they're under investigation for an officer-involved shooting. And the reason that I say that is because, as John mentioned, there are so many levels of investigation that occur currently. And without getting into the pros and cons or maybe the benefits analysis of each one, they're all happening regardless. So the officer is going to be investigated administratively. There will be an internal investigation into their conduct to determine if they acted within not only the law but the policies and procedures of the department. There almost always is an external criminal investigation that's initiated, whether that's initiated as a homicide investigation or just what some jurisdictions refer to as a death investigation, where homicide detectives, people trained in investigating homicides, will look at the officer's conduct to determine if they committed a crime when they were involved in the shooting incident. Then there's also what almost always happens is there's a civil case that's filed in these types of situations, and there will be an investigation kind of as part of the civil case. And what we've seen recently in a lot of focus is there's then kind of a public relations investigation that occurs. And this is a relatively new phenomenon, and in large part facilitated by the prevalence of social media and cameras and phones and those types of things. And probably the least accurate in terms of factual gathering in an investigation, but an important thing to remember nonetheless, because a lot of times that kind of creates a context for the other investigations that are going on simultaneously. And what I think has been largely missing in the context of officer-involved shootings, and even situations where there's a significant use of force or bodily injury occurs short of that's not the result of a shooting, maybe as a result of a pursuit or a near miss. And some would even say, and we've talked about this at the Quattrone Center, wrongful conviction. There has never been an acceptance within the criminal justice system of a root cause analysis investigation, or what we call sentinel event reviews. So we know that I'm going to get on a plane later today. I flew on a plane last night. It's the safest form of travel. There's a reason for that, and I think one of the main reasons is because the NTSB really does thorough investigations, not just of when there's a serious mishap or a plane crashes, but also if there's even a near miss in the air, or if there's if somebody acts inappropriately or makes a mistake on the ground. that triggers a whole root cause analysis, and the results of which are trained then to the pilots and the other folks who are involved in the process. We don't have that in criminal justice. They also do it, I think, pretty successfully in medicine, although I read the other day that there were like 230-some thousand people killed by negligence or malpractice a year in the United States. So there might be actually more room for that in medicine than there is for in the criminal justice system. But nonetheless, there's this tremendous opportunity that's created when you're able to do a kind of peer review or what's called a sentinel event review analysis of these incidents, if for no other reason to try to prevent the next bad incident from occurring. And so we'll get into more of the details as we progress along in the panel. But again, it's a pleasure to be here with you.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Kelvyn Anderson. I'm the Executive Director of Philadelphia's Police Advisory Commission and also the Vice President of NACOL, that's the National Association for Civilian Oversight of Law Enforcement. And what I want to do to help frame our conversation is give you a sense of what the role of police oversight agencies is in particularly around officer-involved shootings, and how that's evolved, how that's changing, certainly in the current atmosphere. There are roughly 144 agencies in 3 broad categories that do oversight around the country, the Police Advisory Commission being one of those. We're going to focus mostly on what has occurred in oversight post-Rodney King, 92. Oversight has a much deeper history that we could certainly talk about, but I'm going to focus for the purposes of our discussion today on what's happened basically since Rodney King, since we were put into play in 1993. You want to think about oversight in 3 broad categories. We began, like the Commission, many other agencies around the country began as investigation-focused agencies. That is, someone files a complaint, we provide investigation of that complaint either alongside the police department or in some instances independent of the police department. And the goal there obviously is to provide some outside eyes other than internal affairs, other than the official police investigation, to bring the citizen's point of view and also to bring a citizen perspective into the investigation process. Those type of models are generally fairly expensive in that in order to actually replace an internal affairs or to work alongside them successfully, you're going to need training. For example, I just spent the last 4 days in Las Vegas training alongside police officers, receiving training on how to conduct internal affairs reviews. What are the particular components of that? In addition to investigation-focused agencies, we also have review models that are done by boards, again, like our commission. I should mention that PAC, my agency, is really a combination or a hybrid of all 3 of these models that I'm about to describe, and that's what you'll see in a number of other agencies around the country. So review-focused models tend to take a finished internal affairs investigation, provide some comment on that. Perhaps they have the power to then kick that back to the police department and say, look, we think you missed this and this. Can you take a look at that again? What's really emerged and is becoming sort of the more go-to model for oversight agencies around the country is the auditor-monitor agency. And you're seeing this around the country in cities like New York. New York has an inspector general that they just put into play over the last couple of years. And those agencies are focused mostly on proactive measures. They're looking at systemic issues. They're taking the vast amount of data that we now have access to around police incidents and trying to not only look at individual incidents, but trying to come up with some way similar to what we're talking about here in root cause analysis to impact on the front end. What can we do better? What have we learned from these incidents? And certainly, just to come back to what we're doing now in Philadelphia, this is where we're headed. Most recently, we found our role increased in Philadelphia. I am now part of the city's Use of Force Review Board. Previously, that was an internal part of the police department that makes the decisions on shootings, justified or not. And that's generally the scope of the review. Is the shooting legally justified under the rules of the department, under the Supreme Court decisions that guide officer use of force? And that's the decision they make, up or down. Is the shooting justified or not? But what we've seen now as a result of the 21st Century Task Force report and also some Department of Justice studies, specifically in Philadelphia, we're trying to ask a broader question that's more in line with what we're talking about here about root cause analysis. Not only is the shooting legally justified, but what have we learned from this? What are our officers learned? What can we tell the community about this? What is the transparency and accountability around the actions that our officers have taken in that instance? So as I said, we're now part of that process. And in fact, just last night I got a call at about 12:30. There was a shooting over in the 24th District, involved a gentleman with a knife. I immediately received the details of that. We have the ability to roll out on the scene. Unfortunately, I was not here, so I could not go out. But we had the ability to roll out on the scene with internal affairs, see exactly how that investigation is being conducted, and then actually be part of the mechanism that makes those decisions on the shooting. So oversight agencies, as I said, are really finding themselves thrust into the forefront of these critical incidents right alongside our police department. And the question now for us becomes, how do we maximize our seat at the table? What type of information are we bringing out to the public? How can we assist the police department and the community in understanding these incidents and bringing that information back to the table to our officers so that they're understanding what goes on, what the community point of view is, and how they can do a better job on the street. So that's just a general outline of how oversight plays into these questions, and I'll then kick it back to my panelists and we can discuss that some more.
Can I jump in for a second just to ask a quick question? So I'm going to abuse my position as moderator to just jump in and ask a couple of clarifying questions. I wonder if you could say a few words about what root cause analysis is and how it differs from a more traditional approach to reviewing these shootings. I gather from what Mr. Anderson just told us that it has something to do with the fact that rather than simply looking to answer the question of whether the shooting is legally justified, we're instead trying to dig deeper to figure out why this happened and how to prevent it in the future. But I wonder if there's some layers of that I'm misunderstanding. And then in connection with that, I wonder if you can give us a sense of what the phrase just culture event reviews means and how it relates to root cause analysis.
Yeah, let me take a stab at that, and then Sean and Kelvyn can jump in. So the concept of a root cause analysis is it's a retrospective discussion of participants in an event where something has gone wrong to understand not so much who should be punished, but what were the environmental circumstances that allowed that convinced somebody to act in a way that an unintended outcome occurred in a system. So if we were to look at a wrong side surgery, right? So a surgery where you're supposed to operate on the patient's right hand, but instead you operate on the patient's left hand. I think the opening assessment would be, well, nobody wanted to operate on the patient's right hand. You had the patient there. The patient had a problem with the left hand, and you wanted to make the patient better. So why did that happen? And a root cause analysis is something that doesn't just go back to the proximate cause, the surface thing. Well, I made a mistake, it was the right arm. It was I operated on the right arm, which in this case was the wrong arm, which means that I'm making a complex thing more complicated by my own mangling of this story. And so what you'll end up doing is you'll go back through many different layers of why people did what they did before you arrive at the environmental circumstances that caused a well-intentioned person to nonetheless make a bad decision. So to put this in a probably emotionally fraught context, let's talk for a minute about Ferguson. Okay, let's talk for a minute about that. There are lots of opinions about what happened in Ferguson, and no matter what you believe actually happened there, what I would posit is that you have eyewitnesses at the scene with diametrically opposed views of the acts. And so I certainly, having not been there, don't believe that I have a firm grasp on the facts, despite all of the various analyses and assessments that have gone on. What I would say is that I think it's difficult to believe that that young man woke up that morning and thought, this is awesome. Today I get to defy a police officer and bleed to death in the street. And I think it's equally unlikely that that police officer woke up and thought, this is great. Today I get to shoot an unarmed black kid and lose my job. Okay? And so the question is, what led to a confrontation between those two people who didn't wake up in the morning seeking it that led to that tragedy? And whether or not that shooting was quote-unquote justified going along with protocols, which is one important review for accountability, I think the system has an accountability measure to the community to say, our system is not designed to have police shooting civilians under any circumstance. What can we do to understand why this led to this situation so that we could have avoided the entire confrontation? What training can we give to people in the community, and what training can we give to police officers, and how can we change the circumstances in which they're operating such that that confrontation and that unintended outcome, that undesirable result is reached? And that's more than just the way you confront the person when you step out of the car. It might be a situation about always having a partner there. It might be a situation about changing the weaponry that the police officer has. It might go to all sorts of different things, and those are root causes, because the proximate cause was we had an officer acting alone in a situation with a guy in which he was afraid in a confrontation, and it led to this conflagration that nobody wanted. A probably less emotionally charged way to do it would be to say, what happens when Carson Wentz throws an interception? Okay, we know that Carson Wentz didn't want to throw that interception. So the question is, what did you see as that play was unfolding that made you think that that pass was the right thing for you to do? And what might we change so that next time you see something different or make a different pass? Did you see Selleck going deep? Did you realize that your left tackle had fallen down so the pocket was breaking? Was there a different blitz that you hadn't noticed? And if we think about that in real time and we change those things, now you're going to make a different pass and we get a better result, right? That's the goal of root cause analysis. Now, when we talk about just culture event reviews, it's actually a phrase taken from the healthcare literature, and it actually stemmed from a conversation that I had with the chair of the National Transportation Safety Board, because he was using the phrase blame-free event reviews. And I said, look, I really appreciate what you're talking about here. Blame-free is great, but these people are criminal justice professionals. Blame is what they do all day. You know, you say blame-free, and they start going, no, what about the bad people? And he said, look, just because you're a pilot doesn't mean you can't show up drunk for work, okay? And in criminal justice, that's true too. Just culture is this idea that we're professionals in criminal justice. In fact, we take pride in being professionals. Police want to be held to certain standards. It's why they wear that badge, right? They sign up, they swear, they're sworn officers, and they do that with a lot of pride. And the thing that I'm struck with in a lot when I watch these videos now is the reaction of the police officers after, as they're sort of coming down from that emotion. I don't know if you guys saw the video of the guy who got tased. He was actually sort of cuffed but continued to resist, and he got tased like 30 times in the back of this car. And at the end of it, the officer is shaking with emotion, and he says, I'm done, man. I'm done. My career's over. And it's, you know, to the point that you made about the most dangerous time is these reviews, these police officers don't, in the vast majority of instances, don't want to do these things. They don't want to hurt people. That's not why they signed up for the job. And so the accountability of punishment is only going to be effective to deter the intentional acts of misconduct. Punishment doesn't deter an unintended act and outcome. And so the question is, how do we change the environment to do that? So this is a fundamentally different type of analysis, because we're asking a fundamentally different question. We're not asking whose head's going to roll or who's going to write the check to make this better. We're asking, what are the environmental circumstances that allowed these people, despite their training, to get into a situation where something horrible happened? And so let me pause there, because I've gone on for a while, and ask you guys to
just
chime
one
in.
thing I would jump in and say, not to be disagreeable, but I think that the purpose of the analysis is to do it even when it's not a bad outcome necessarily, like the wrong outcome in air quotes for people that are listening, because you could have a perfectly legal and justifiable officer-involved shooting or use of force or pursuit or whatever. that doesn't mean that a root cause analysis would not be helpful in preventing another one, in creating training for other officers, for people in the community, and for sharing information so that these types of incidents can be avoided in the future. You know, I think in terms of doing these like Sentinel event reviews, which is basically kind of an interchangeable term, I guess I'm used to using that term.
Well, the Sentinel event is like when the Challenger explodes, right? And the idea is that it's a big enough tragedy that the whole organization can finally say, okay, yeah, we've really got to examine this, right? And so there are lots of smaller errors that happen every day for a root cause analysis or a just culture review that evaluates sort of professionalism, but the Sentinel event is the big one.
But the idea is that, you know, everyone who was involved, whether it's a surgery or a shooting or a train wreck, everyone who's involved sits around a table, and usually it's a round table, and it's a non-blaming. There's actually some laws that have been put into place to protect people in the medical field in particular. And if you look at the President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing report, you'll see a recommendation under Policy and Oversight. I think it's recommendation 2.3, and under Officer Safety and Wellness, which is recommendation 6.7, where Congress is urged to actually pass a law similar to the law that they passed for healthcare quality to kind of facilitate these types of reviews so that you can have a private conversation where blame isn't the issue, liability isn't the issue, figuring out what went wrong and how to prevent it from happening in the future is the total focus. And I can totally envision a time, particularly now, where we have so much more data. Not just in terms of statistical data, but body camera data and dashboard camera data and CCTV data and personal cell phone data, that you could aggregate all of this information and sit down with everyone who was involved in an incident and take it piece by piece and figure out where did we fall short? Did we fall short in our training on when to use a taser versus a firearm? Did we fall short in terms of identifying somebody who's in a critical mental crisis? And then push that out not only within a police department itself to train the officers there for the shortcomings, but also to push that out in a more of a national format through police training and standards boards, so that you can have really meaningful training built on real life scenarios and avoid these things, avoid these types of incidents in the future. And look, it's not, first of all, any use of force is not pretty. I don't care if it's the most justified legally, morally, ethically, it still doesn't look good. And I've seen a lot of it in my work, as I'm sure you have. But if we're really interested in promoting a profession and preventing tragedies, we have to create a safe space for officers and others who are involved in the criminal justice system to come together and say, how do we avoid this from happening again? And that's really what the root cause analysis is about for me.
I think to consider, for example, the change in the language we use. Even the body that I'm on now, the Use of Force Review Board, previously was called the Firearms Review Board, and as I said, they focused exclusively on, is the shooting justified or not? So now we find ourselves in a position, as Sean pointed out, that we have to consider a much broader range of information in terms of figuring out these incidents. I can tell you without revealing any secrets from that body, one of the things that we're looking at right now is dog shootings, for example. We've seen our discharges, thankfully, trend in the right direction in Philadelphia. We've had 3 fatals this year. We had 3 last year. That's down considerably from what it's been over previous years. So now we find ourselves in a position of worrying about dog shootings. There are lots of them. There's lots of opportunity for things to go very wrong and have citizens injured. The last one we looked at, the officer came up on a scene. Folks are struggling with a dog that's biting a kid. They shoot the dog. the round goes on into someone's living room. And it's not easy to imagine what could have happened if that round had ended up elsewhere. So we find ourselves, again, having to consider a much broader set of circumstances in order to try and prevent those. Now, this is not just a police department problem. This also impacts how we deal with dangerous dogs in the city. The agency that is supposed to go around and identify and deal with that is underpowered. We have 2 or 3 folks in that part of the city agency that deals with that who are overwhelmed with dangerous dogs in Philadelphia. So who ends up dealing with them? Police end up dealing with them. I don't think we really want cops dealing with that. Police don't want to. They don't necessarily have the training to do that. So again, there's a much broader set of questions on the table for us to consider. Likewise, think about the evolution of early warning systems, for example. Previously, early warning systems that we set up to help identify officers who may be heading in a direction we don't want had a set of circumstances they looked at, some data points, how long the officer had been on the street, where they worked, etc. Now, with all the sophisticated algorithms are out there, we're considering a much broader set of circumstances in order to get to the root cause of what can help us make that better. And many times that means looking outside of what police do and also figuring out how the other institutions that play into these incidents affect change. I think a great example of that is crisis intervention training. The way officers deal with folks who are in mental health crisis has changed significantly over the last 20, 25 years. We know, for example, that when we first started to put that program together in Philadelphia, we recognized that one of the problems was officers did not know where to take people who were in crisis. So we had to have a response from our behavioral health community in order to make that a better system. We've done that, and in fact, for the most part, those types of incidents have been reduced as a result of those broader considerations. So I think that's what we're trying to get at from our point of view.
You know, the other thing that comes into play here too, I wanted to just pick up on a point that you were making, Kelvyn, is, and what we found in a number of cases where there's an inappropriate use of force, or at least a use of force that shocks the public conscience. And I'm thinking of a case in Texas where I don't remember the name of the town, but where a police officer was seen kind of very strongly handling a teenage girl who was wearing a bathing suit. There was the pool incident thing. And so, and that looked bad to everyone. And, you know, one of the things that came out in the after action, you know, in the aftermath of that, in terms of like an early warning, it doesn't have to be that intricate of a system. But, you know, that officer's previous call was unsuccessfully trying to resuscitate a baby. And so, you know, there are some things that we can, that we need to consider in terms of root cause analysis. You know, if they had done an investigation, a root cause analysis investigation on that, they may have adopted a policy afterwards that when an officer is involved in that type of a traumatic call, they're taken out of service for a period of time and not immediately rushed into the next call, because there is a conglomerative kind of impact of that trauma that officers experience throughout their day. And so I think that's an important thing that I think we're missing in the process.
So I want to be able to open this up for questions, but before I do that, I want to ask, I'm going to abuse my position as moderator once again, and ask about the role of race in a just culture events review. We haven't really touched on that specifically yet, and at least if I'm understanding the discussion so far, it sounds like the purpose of this root cause analysis, the just culture events review, is to try to figure out why the shooting happened and how to prevent it in the future. But it seems as if the focus of that analysis is to have better training going forward, it might be missing something about what's needed before people even get on the force. So I'm wondering if there's any move toward doing screenings of people who apply to be police officers, sort of digging deep into their background so that issues around bias, either implicit or explicit, are uncovered early, and they're just not allowed to be police officers? Because I feel like I don't want to suggest the answer, but I'd like you all to speak to questions of race and how that structural inequality around race plays into this discussion.
So I could talk about this a little bit because of my work with the task force on 21st century policing and some of the subsequent convenings that have gone on. There's actually 2 works in progress now, one on recruiting and one on hiring, that are being funded by the COPS office. There'll be publications coming out probably in the next 60 days or so. So yes, to answer your question, there are a number of recommendations, and some departments are already doing it in terms of, the explicit bias is fairly easy to identify, especially because people do utilize social media so much. It's not terribly difficult to find that stuff. The challenge is, there are roughly 18,000 police departments in the United States, and over 90% of those departments have less than 20 officers. But the police officer who's wearing a badge from a community of 1,500 where it's a 3-man police department has the same legal authority as the police officer that's wearing a badge in Philadelphia. And unfortunately, that small department doesn't have the resources to do the type of background investigations that a city like Philadelphia would have. And so that's one of the challenges that I think, are out there. So departments there are things that they can do, but, one of the big things that really needs to happen is there needs to be some type of support mechanism or network mechanism for smaller departments to be able to utilize in terms of doing background investigations before officers are hired. In terms of the implicit bias, that's much more difficult to detect, and even folks from the psychology and psychiatric community can tell you that that's very difficult to identify. And even identifying it wouldn't necessarily disqualify somebody, because what we know from the science is implicit bias can be trained out, and that's something that the task force report talks about, something the Director Comey, the FBI director, has talked about on a number of different occasions. I think it's important to talk about it, and I'm glad you raised the issue because, implicit bias is real. I've heard a presidential candidate even acknowledge that everybody probably has an implicit bias. And the positive thing about implicit bias that we know is that if you're trained to recognize that bias, in particular for police officers, they can check it. So, if they've had the appropriate implicit bias training, they're able to check themselves and say, should I really be looking at this person, or am I just looking at this person because they're black or they're Hispanic or they look like the last 3 people I arrested? And that's a really important kind of internal analysis for them to do. And by the way, you're very clear. You have the Constitutional Center here in Philadelphia. Former Commissioner Chuck Ramsey from Philadelphia instituted some tremendous bias training here in Philly. So for those of you that are from this area, you're very fortunate to have the kind of resources in terms of law enforcement training on bias that is frankly not available in a lot of places around the country.
So the process of a root cause analysis actually, I think, is a more likely way to discover the need to do implicit bias training, right? So there's nothing inherent in the process of, let's look at this review and the circumstances in which it happened to try and figure out, the series of events that led to this unfortunate conclusion that is inherently race-based. What you might discover, though, is that the reason that the officer began engaging with the citizens was, oh, well, this was suspicious activity. And when you ask the question, well, what was it that made it suspicious? They say, oh, well, it was the following sort of interactions that I see all the time. And what you find in these, officer-involved shootings or use of force situations is that typically the officer goes in with a certain amount of pattern recognition from the experience of their job, right? They've seen these scenarios play out. They know what they think is a corner buy, or you know, they're walking into a domestic violence situation. They've gotten certain training. They've been involved in these before, and they move forward with the expectation that this event is going to be a lot like all the other ones they've seen, and that the activity that they've identified as problematic, you know, is problematic because of their histories. And that, I think, is where implicit bias begins to get involved. And so as you peel that back and understand specifically, okay, you're walking up, you see the following thing, what exactly do you see? And you start looking at it, again, through sort of that videotape analysis thing. Tell me why you thought this at this moment, and then why did you decide to do that? And when you break that down, not in the perspective of, I need to know this so that I can decide what to do with your job and your future, but so that I understand what the next police officer is going to be thinking when he or she is in that position, then you actually get different insights into it, and then you can learn whether or not you have an implicit bias issue that then needs to be resolved in changing that environment, so that then you've done training that says, recognize let's make explicit your implicit bias so that it can then be out there and dealt with. And I think it's the process by which you get to that is more likely to happen than an internal affairs investigation where the police officer really doesn't want to talk to internal affairs because, you know, his best case scenario is that he's on administrative leave for a period of time. And then it all kind of, for him, goes downhill for there. So.
Yeah, we tend to think about this certainly in the context that we've discussed already. Obviously, we want our officers to be aware of this. We have begun to institute this training in Philadelphia. We've trained our supervisors. There are plans to roll out that training to the entire department. I'm also concerned from my point of view with the experiences of the community. We recognize that policing disproportionately affects black and brown people in my city. I know that. They come to me, they tell me what their experiences are. I see them in the statistics that come across my desk every day. I talk to them, they come to my meetings, they file complaints. So one of the things I'm trying to understand is, from their point of view, how has that level of disproportionate policing that takes place in minority communities affected you on that basic level? So in trying to draw them into the conversation, not just as the subject of policing, but as part of the solution for changes that we want to make. What is it that we need to do differently to stop the very high level of unconstitutional, frankly, stop and frisk that takes place in our city? It's a huge number. It's off the charts. The department itself acknowledges this. So what I want to do then is to understand how that's affected my community and how I can bring them to the table as part of the solution. Yes, we do have to focus on the training of our officers. That's very important. But I also need to understand how this has impacted my community and how to bring them to the table as part of the solution and not simply the subject of those types of use of force or those activities.
Would it be okay if I open it up to questions then?
Sure.
All right, thank you. So questions from the floor? Or we could just have you go on? Okay, there you go.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I definitely can respect and understand the comparison between aviation and medical and criminal justice, right? But one of the key words you mentioned is confrontation. So when I'm getting on a plane, I'm not in confrontation with my pilot. When I'm going to surgery, I'm not in confrontation with my surgeon, at least I hope not. So I'm saying that because while I can understand this overall assessment of mistakes and how do we reduce error, for me, in the issue of criminal justice, especially where this issue around race or gender or class, all of these pieces come into play, and it's a confrontation. And so when we're talking about disproportionate minority contact, which is something that we work on here in Montgomery County, and you know, you have a diversionary program for youth where white youth are diverted. They're successfully put through the program, their records are clear. You know, in comparison, you've had very few black and brown youth even being suggested as a program. So I guess what I'm going to ask is, I understand what you're saying in terms of making this a reduction model and looking at it from the scientific perspective, but maybe the question becomes, how many white officers shoot unarmed white people? And where are the numbers that say, you know, where's the comparison between, in other words, I don't see how we can have this conversation without getting into the fact that there is an inherent issue of injustice, like I don't know what the right word is, right? There's an inherent issue of discrimination. And if we're going to look at this as, you know, I don't know that a doctor says, well, I'm going to look at the race of my patient before I do surgery, or a pilot gets on their plane and says, well, I don't even see my pilot when I get on the plane, most of the time. So I'm saying that because we're talking about a one-on-one interaction, or 201 or 301, and we've seen countless situations where many cops jump in on a situation in Philadelphia and elsewhere, who aren't even on the scene. They come on in and jump on in. So I guess what I'm trying to ask is, if we're going to look at it from that perspective, then who can tell me, or who has the data that says, what are the instances where you have a white police officer with a white victim versus a white police officer with someone who's been shot and killed who's not? And where does that part of the conversation come in when we're looking at these dynamics? Because we definitely have situations that we can talk about today where, even in situations with diversion, where young people are equally at fault, equally in the same situation, but clearly still white youth are being diverted and black youth are being criminal weapons.
So it's quite a question.
Sorry.
No. I mean, but there's a lot in there to try and unpack, right? And I think there are things that root cause analysis can do, and there are things that are unreasonable to expect of it. So I might sort of, let's start with the diversion program, okay? So a question about whether a diversion program is being fairly applied to people of all races is really, I think, an unfair question to ask about a police accountability root cause analysis question. Yes, do you have a potential for racial bias? Absolutely you do, and that's something that needs to be dealt with. Is that something that a review of an officer-involved engagement is necessarily going to be able to get at? I doubt it. If the question that you want to ask is the result of officer-involved engagements with white kids and kids of color lead to different outcomes in the recommendation or the charging that comes from the police, then again, I think that's a useful and important question to ask, but reviewing an individual incident isn't necessarily going to give you the aggregate sense of everything that's going on, such that you might want to change your policies or do different kinds of training. In the instance of a Ferguson, or the police officer at the pool, or the dog shooting that Kelvyn described, each of those is an individual situation where something went wrong. One of the questions that needs to be asked is, was there a racial bias at work, either in the officer's actions, the environment in which that officer was deployed, the supervision that officer was given, the training that officer was given, the direction on balance of the policies that officer is given. So if the implicit or explicit directives of a stop and frisk are, that you're going to stop black and brown people more than you're going to stop white people, or if the explicit policies are, we're going to police this jurisdiction differently than that jurisdiction for one reason or another, that needs to be evaluated. And that's the sort of thing that a root cause analysis can begin to get you, because you start looking at it case by case. There are situations in aviation where there have been plane crashes because you have pilots and co-pilots who speak different languages or have different cultural backgrounds. So there's one very well-known international flight that crashed because the co-pilot was Korean, the pilot was American, and the co-pilot who was Korean had a cultural deference to pilots that is sort of ingrained in the Korean culture. This is not me speaking, this is the result of the evaluation. As a result of which he was more hesitant to speak up as he watched the pilot doing certain things that were maybe not along with protocol. So maybe we should go talk to our pilots before we get on those planes, and those cultural things do happen even if they're invisible. What's happened in aviation is that over 40 years of doing these things, every one of them has led to modifications and change, and they've begun to share the information. So it's a networking of the root cause analysis that's led to the gradual improvement of it. So I totally agree with all of the concerns that you're raising, and they're important ones to raise, but an individual case event review isn't going to solve your diversion program entry criteria bias challenge.
I think your question has gone to one of the more interesting results of the Department of Justice study of shootings in Philadelphia. In terms of police shootings of unarmed folks, it was actually, I think, just as many or even more white folks who were shot by police than black in the unarmed situation. Now, where we need to go, obviously, is a deeper question. I can't tell you off the top of my head what the races of the officers involved in those particular incidents were, but we see that as a starting point to begin to answer some of those deeper questions. I just don't think we have enough to go there yet. But I was surprised to actually find out that that was true in Philadelphia, and that's a sub-point that we're looking very closely at.
It's also true nationally. The trend is almost identical to Philadelphia, as a matter of fact, percentage-wise.
So I have a question over here.
Well, it's sort of a comment feeding in on that, but it's hard to say where race stops and income inequality begins, because I had to do a case in Graterford, and I was there for civil rights case. I was there for weeks looking at all the prison records, and there, a disproportionate number of people from Philadelphia are of color. When you go back and look at the 30s, you'll see it was basically poor people that were in jail, like at Holmesburg. I had to review all of that. But Philadelphia was thoroughly corrupt through maybe the 70s or 80s, who got off and who got convicted. And today it's so much better. I mean, you just saw the FBI investigation of some of the municipal court judges. People don't get passes if they're white and middle class today, which they could have gotten in the past. So really, the prison population is usually lower class, economic class, and the police feel freer to deal with people in that class than they do with people out on the main line. We just had a symposium here on the heroin epidemic, and once it reached the main line and middle class and upper class people, all of a sudden it's a medical problem. Before that, it was a criminal law problem. But I don't see any clear-cut division between race, ethnicity, and economic class. It all blends together.
Did anyone want to respond to that, or should I take another question?
I'm good.
Okay, so in the back, and then over here.
So I'm getting ready to send my 5'1", 100-pound teenager to college next year. And many of the schools she's looking at are in urban areas. I should note that my daughter is biracial. And I've had many discussions with her about having the total respect for police. And when the police tell you to stop, you stop, you don't question, you don't do any of that. I guess my concern with root cause analysis and even understanding your analogy to Carson Wentz, every situation is different. Whether it's a police officer involved with something or Carson Wentz trying to not throw a hit, whatever it is, everything is different. Whatever's going on biologically with that officer or a football player, whatever's going on around him, there's always something different. And I know when I think about sending my child to urban schools, the last thing that I want is for a police officer to be second-guessing things and holding back, because it's not only his own life or her own life as an officer that's at risk, but also my child's life if she's possibly being victimized, or innocent bystanders that may be nearby if the officer doesn't act quickly enough. And I think that there's only so many times you can tell someone, put your hands up, stop, let us see your hands. I mean, I guess my concern is sending my daughter out. I don't want a police officer to second guess when she's in that situation, because, quite frankly, and I haven't worked in a public defender's office, the number of calls, 911 calls, that come from down by Temple, for example, versus that come from out by Chestnut Hill College, totally different. Totally different. So the police are going to go where those calls are. And so when I'm thinking about an urban area to put my child for safety, I would rather a police officer know that he can act with that autonomy to be able to ensure his own preservation of life as well as a potential victim. I understand that people do have rights and they shouldn't be shot wrongfully, but quite frankly, if it's between innocent bystanders or potential victims and someone that a police officer is pursuing, I would much rather my own child be protected as opposed to someone else that's not cooperating with the police.
Oh, you big guy. I would just, in response to that, I would just say, first of all, good luck. I have a daughter who's a senior in high school, and we're looking at colleges too. And I appreciate your clearly heartfelt concerns. I don't want anyone to leave here with the feeling that we're saying that doing these root cause analysis are the panacea to the, going to solve all these problems. They're not. Bad things can still happen, but they're also not designed to create any type of hesitancy, as you're describing. At the end of the day, the thought, I think, behind doing these types of investigations and analysis, particularly in the context of officer conduct, is to create a culture within policing where we're able to identify and hire the best people, identify and provide them with the best equipment, and identify and provide them with the best possible training. And that has not been the primary goal in policing nearly to the effect that it has been and is in terms of hiring medical professionals and pilots and other people in these types of critical decision-making employment positions. And so I don't want anyone to think that we're saying this is going to solve everything. It's not. But I think it will help promote and push forward our ability to get the best people, get them the best equipment and the best training, and to make sure that your daughter and my daughter and everyone else's child gets a consistently well-trained, well-equipped, and well-developed person wearing a badge when they need assistance or are being dealt with in terms of police.
So we're starting to run a little bit short on time, and I have two more questions. I want to go to the gentleman here, and then I'd like to go to the back, and hopefully we'll have time for both.
My question, right on the topic that you're talking about, Smoot, I believe you said earlier that 18,000, there's 18,000 police departments across the country, roughly?
Roughly.
The goal that you're speaking about in terms of hiring better trained officers, hiring better equipped officers, hiring the correct people, how do you trickle that down to the local level? Because in this area right here, as we sit here, there are probably 5 different police departments policing this area.
Way more than that.
So how do you trickle that down to the local level so that to make sure they hire the best people, to make sure that they hire the most trained people, and to make sure that it's not your cousin you're hiring because it's your cousin?
That's the conundrum. I mean, that's, clearly, when I figure that out, you'll never see me again, I'll be honest. But I think it starts, if you look, and if you haven't, I would encourage you to go to the COPS website and look at the President's Task Force report, because there are a lot of recommendations in there that will lead the profession to do that. But one of the places it starts is creating some standardized, like the floor, not the ceiling, but a floor standardized background investigation that all departments should be required to use. We're looking at actually writing that into state statute in Illinois now. And then also a floor of standard of training that every officer should get. I don't think that my daughter, if I send her to Villanova, should have much of a different experience in her interaction with the police officer than she would in downtown Chicago or in small town USA. I think we should be able to rely on some consistency there, and I think that's the way to push it.
If I can speak to that quickly too, the Pennsylvania State Legislature did a study back, I believe in 2010, that said any police department with, I think, roughly 10 officers or less should be consolidated. Around the country, a number of state legislatures have also recognized this. In part, I think that's an organizational, institutional solution to what you're describing there. We do have far too many police departments. I think the task force recognized that. Consolidation of those smaller departments is in part trying to address that solution in some ways.
Yeah, and last thing, and I know we have one more question, so I'll be really brief. When we talk about root cause analysis, I want to emphasize that all of the other administrative, external, internal, criminal, civil reviews, they all have their place, right? And one of those is to say, well, how did you do your hiring? Did you do it in accordance with the best practices of the industry? And is that part of why you as an organization ought to be liable to remedy this past wrong? The root cause analysis is actually designed to do something in parallel, right? So it's to say, how should we improve our hiring practices based on what happened here? It doesn't replace these other things that people are concerned about as far as how we hold people accountable and how we deal with a tragedy that has happened. But what we would do is it would operate, it's got a different goal than those procedures. And so my argument would be it's something we should incorporate in addition to and not in place of the reviews that we're talking about.
And that's the recommendation as well.
Yeah.
So we're actually a bit over time, but if we can be brief, then we'll take one more question.
So I had the pleasure of sitting through Lori Friedell's Fair and Impartial Policing class when Commissioner Ramsey brought her into Philly, and that whole team. And it was a really tremendous class, and some of the conversations with the officers and the supervisors afterwards was, this is great. It was a 3-day class where we all got really conversational and looked at inherent bias, both positive inherent bias and negative inherent bias, because it goes both ways. But how is it that you can take a 3-day class and then thread it through not only the police academy trainings, but every single ongoing, recertification training? And the gentleman over here mentioned trickle down. I'm thinking trickling up, because how can you have an academy grad come out and get in a car with an old head who's going to say to that new, fresh-faced police officer, throw all that crap you learned in the academy out the window? So, have you seen that departments taking on and threading it through entire curriculums versus just a 3-day, here you're going to have this, it's intense, the end?
So I can tell you, again, and I hate to keep referring back to my home state, but it's the one I'm most familiar with. So in Illinois, they actually passed a statute over a year ago. It went into effect January 1st this year. And it's called the Police Community Relations Act. And part of that act created required police training by state statute, which had never happened before, by the way. There was never actual statutory training requirements. And part of the requirements now in Illinois are that officers in basic training have to receive cultural competency, cultural responsiveness training, as well as training on implicit bias. And then all in-service officers have to receive, at a minimum, every 3 years, implicit bias training. And so that's kind of how we're trying to deal with it. And I think, I've talked to legislators from other states, including this one, where they're interested in doing some mirror legislation to create that responsibility. One of the things that you have to remember, again, looking through the wider lens, when budgets get cut, the first thing to get cut in the police department is training. Absolute first thing to get cut. And it's the worst thing to cut. So, by making it a statutory mandate, you kind of insulate it from budget cuts, at least, again, creating the same experience with police officers, whether they're in a big city or a smaller town. They're all going to have this training.
Okay, well, thank you so much. I appreciate your being here.